And welcome to Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co host, Ray Smith. Good morning, Ray.
Hi, Keith. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. Let's get right into this today. We've got a
Yeah,
very special guest and a very special program.
we do. I'm really glad that Benita Albert has agreed to come and tell us her stories about graduates from Oak Ridge schools. She's a retired teacher from Oak Ridge High School. She taught math and advanced placement classes. Her students won a lot of national competitions. And a few years ago, she approached me about including some of these stories about some of the Oak Ridge graduates who had accomplished significant things in their life, if I would want to put them in historically speaking. And of course, Keith, you know, I jumped at that, not only to get somebody else to write in that article that I've been running years every week, but to get it tied so close to significant accomplishments of people from Oak Ridge. Now, what she's going to do today is she's going to share some of those stories with us. So, Benita, I'm really glad to have you here. Keith and I just have been looking forward to this. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started on your presentation, okay?
All right. You're nice to say that I approached you. Actually, it was your brainchild, Ray, that started the whole impetus toward writing the alumni story. Ray was one of our best supporters of the 75th anniversary book for the Oak Ridge schools, which was an effort out of the Oak Ridge Public Schools Education Foundation to honor the first 75 classes. And in doing that, I was in charge of finding 75 class writers. We called them anchor authors. And it wasn't easy in the 40s because we'd lost a lot of them. But I did find them. And so I realized many things that I thought were true about Oak Ridge schools, how fond they were of the community and of their education, how well prepared they seemed to be beyond, the years that we had them in their avocations and their vocations in life. And those stories just became phenomenal. So I agreed with you, Ray, that, I think this could be very, very interesting to write about them. And so if you're ready for me to roll, I'm going to start with the 40s because I want to tell a little background on finding these people and then tell you about them.
Okay, go right ahead.
Okay, so we actually over a period of 18 months, published a book. And one of the last things we were able to do was find those anchor authors from the very first class in the Oak Ridge schools and from other years. And that basically came about by referral from older people who said, I don't feel comfortable doing it. That check with so-and-so, check with so-and-so. So over a period of time, I found Pearl Price Deering from the class of 43-44, the first senior class at Oak Ridge High School. And also I found Charlie Price from the class of 47. So the reason I want to start with them is they were there on the first day of school in 1943. It was October 1st, 1943. I'm referring to notes here, so I won't miss this, okay? And as we understand, there were 84 total students enrolled on that day. And of course it grew. Of course it grew because Oak Ridge was just mushrooming its population at that point in time. But those 84 came from families who had secured housing and therefore, needed schooling as of the minute the school opened. So Pearl, her twin brother Earl, and Charlie all enrolled that day. Pearl and Earl were seniors in the senior class, and Charlie was a freshman. And so I should say that by the end of the first school year, again, it was based on housing availability, right? Oak Ridge High School grew to 400 students by the end of the first year. And I personally worked with one of those original teachers, Peg Mars, who was hired as the first math teacher at high school. And she said they had to add staff members along the year, right? They added 2 others to her department. She said that you could expect just any given day another student to walk in the door, right? And you needed to accommodate, bring them up to speed. She said an interesting story was that John was a very popular name. And so they weren't allowed to record last names. They just recorded first names and called students by their first names. And so she got the first John early on. Soon afterwards in the same class, she got a second John. So she decided to number them, John 1, John 2. She said, I got as high as John 3, which was more than the books of the Bible, but it was a different time, a very, very different time. So I had the honor to talk to Pearl in the 90s and to pick up a couple of interesting stories from her. I think my favorite was that the small senior class decided that they would create the first senior skip day. And what they did for senior skip day was to walk down the hill, because the Oak Ridge High School was up above Blankenship Field, as most people would identify it now. Walk down the hill to Jackson Square, but it wasn't called Jackson Square back then. Ray, do you remember what it was called?
Townside? Is that what
I'm sorry, Townside. That's right, to Townside. That's the word she used. That's right. And I'm not quizzing you, Ray. I just didn't have it in front of me, so I couldn't remember. Went down to the theater and watched the movie For Whom the Bell Tolls. That was at the Ridge Theater, which would have been where the Playhouse is now. Is that right?
No, the Ridge Theater was down near to where Big Ed's is.
Oh, Big Ed's in that area. Okay. The Ridge, she did say the Ridge Theater. So they were just within. Yeah, they were just within hollering, distance from their teachers, right? Who might have been looking for them. But as a result, when they tried to return the next day, nope, they weren't admitted. They were assigned a 1,500-word essay. And the title of the essay was Good Citizenship, to be submitted before reinstatement and approval for graduation. And, I said to Pearl, I said, well, that was an English exercise, wasn't it? Didn't it count for something? Nope. You had to turn your essay in if you wanted to graduate. She also remembered the long climb, because they would let students off at a bus stop on Tennessee Avenue, down where the old post office used to be. And they would have to walk through town and then cross the street on up the 70s or 67 or 70 steps, whatever it is, are still there up to the high school, right, up the hill. And so they were known as the students who climbed the hill, right? She also mentioned that Earl was immediately drafted, but had already signed up and left after graduation. And Earl is now deceased, but he did not return to Oak Ridge, as far as I know. And she said that in her class, at least 7 to 9, I don't remember the exact number, actually left early for their military service. Wow. So she went on in Oak Ridge. She briefly worked here as a secretary before she went to Carson Newman and met a preacher husband. And they worked in various churches in the South in her 80s. I'm talking about her age of 80s. She worked missions work in Africa, and later was part of a 3-year church building mission to Romania. Wow. So I got to meet her in person with Charlie, because Charlie said, well, let's go visit her. You need to go see her. And so we visited as soon as the 75th book came out, so we could present a book to her. And oh my goodness, the two of them talking back and forth memories was an incredible experience for me. So
I'm
Charlie
sure.
was class of 47, right? He started at Oak Ridge High School as a freshman. And he said, he told the family background. He said, we came from up near Dandridge. My dad was a farmer, a miner, and we were desperate for money. And so when my dad heard there was work on a new project, he jumped at it. He needed the job, right? It was hard times. And so he said that what a change it was for him to come into Oak Ridge schools. And this is what he said, where we had textbooks, gym classes, library, music, and what he really loved, after school teen rec halls. And he talked a lot about that because parents were not at home, they were working, right? That was kind of the provision for students to have a place to go, something to do after school. He left Oak Ridge High School during his senior year, and he joined the U.S. Army Occupation Forces in Japan. So he was at Hiroshima, and he saw the results of his hometown's war missions. And, he obviously was proud of his father's work. As I understand, I believe his father was at K-25. And he said, my father never talked about it, but I knew they were doing important work. I knew it was war mission. He said, if anybody ever asked him what he did on his job, he would say, I make striped paint. So that's Pearl and Charlie, and yeah.
Oh, all right.
I should also say that he was proud to see his three children graduate from Oak Ridge High School later. He came back to Oak Ridge and he worked in teletype services. I had to look that up. I'd heard of it, but I didn't know for sure what that meant. He worked in teletype services for Bell Telephone for years and years and years. All right.
Okay. Next.
Mary Elizabeth Alexander is my next one. She's from the class of 1953. And if Oak Ridgers don't know that name, then they need to listen. They need to hear what an effect she had on this community. Mary Elizabeth arrived with her father, who they were from Madisonville, Tennessee, in 1945, which was her fifth grade year. They would have come sooner, but the housing didn't become available until then. She loved Oak Ridge schools. From the minute she walked in the door, she said, I loved meeting students and teachers from across the United States. She said, I was impressed by the new teaching methods and materials. I loved the whole new academic and arts offerings, I'm quoting her, and other enrichment and leadership opportunities. She got to serve as a library assistant, and she said that was just heaven. That she loved books so much, and she couldn't believe how many books were available for reading in her new school. She was allowed to be a student assistant in a kindergarten classroom. She said they had a student council. We'd never heard of anything like that. So I joined student council. She couldn't believe there were school counselors. And in high school, she especially enjoyed having an all-female math teacher as her examples. They became her role models, as she said. So things had changed. Actually, if you go back to that first year, Peg Mars said the second person added was a young man who was quite good in the math department in 1943, 44. But soon after, he was called up on the draft. So he went to war. And it wasn't unusual for an all-female staff of math or science teachers. Mary Elizabeth loved sports and was very active in the intramural program, which was the only girls' sports opportunities provided at Oak Ridge High School. So she decided to do something about it because she loved it. So she and a group of her friends, intramural basketball friends, approached the Oak Ridge High School administration about forming a girls' varsity basketball team. And this group of girls volunteered to organize a game with the Oliver Springs High School varsity team already playing right nearby. Final decision from the administration, she said, was, and she quoted, "The sport is just too exhausting and too strenuous to play for females." If you fast forward to 1972, that's when we finally got a girls varsity basketball team at Oak Ridge High School. And by then, Mary Elizabeth was an Oak Ridge Schools educator and one of the biggest cheerleaders for the program to begin. Mary Elizabeth won an OREA, Oak Ridge Education Association scholarship, $250, which was a lot of money back then, which allowed her to go to ETSU. She majored in math and science and added a teacher certification. And fortunately for us, a job in California didn't work out that she had hoped for, and she came home and stayed with us in the Oak Ridge schools for 39 years. So she was not the first Oak Ridge graduate to come back to teach. Rumor is that was an teacher at Oak Ridge High School. I don't remember which one, Hamby or Grossman, but she probably was the second Oak Ridge grad to come back home and teach in her school system. What I really, really, really admire about Mary Elizabeth is she's still out and active in the community, and she doesn't tell stories like this, except she told me, and I really think this needs some notice. Of her many accomplishments, I'm reading here because I don't want to mess any of this up, and added degree work, I feel her greatest contribution was with the Civil Rights Project, where she served as the home school coordinator for the Scarborough community in implementing the final stage of desegregation of all students K through 6. And that was in the mid-60s that this project started. She was instrumental in the creation of the first preschool offering for Scarborough children. It actually started there with her during this same mid-60s transition period. Preschool education premiered here in Oak Ridge before the state offered it. Oh. It has been a popular program with overflowing student enrollment, and it's now in a new school fittingly located in the Scarborough community. If you don't know enough of what I've said here, which is never enough, about the amazing Miss Alexander, there are stories that she wrote for the 75th book that are funny, heart-wrenching, amazing, amazing stories. And we also include some of the information about her work with the Civil Rights Project. So I've got another piece of paper here that just summarizes her career journey in the Oak Ridge School. She started as an Oak Ridge School math and science teacher at Robertsville. They moved her to the Civil Rights Project work, where she was, as I said, a homeschool coordinator, on to a counselor, because she had added a counseling degree by then principal. She was principal of Cedar Hill School until it was closed in, I believe, mid-80s, and then moved to administration and eventually retired as the director of pupil personnel. He had a huge impact on Oak Ridge education. Questions?
Wow, that's really good. I did not remember all of those details. Thank you for bringing that to light.
Yeah.
He's a great one for sure.
Okay. All right. Okay, Keith, did you have a question earlier? I thought you did. No. Okay. All right. So let's go on to 1957 and a man who's become a dear, dear friend of mine, Archie Lee. Okay. Archie was part of the Scarborough 85. And when I say that, hopefully most people know, part of the group of 85 students who first integrated into the Oak Ridge school system in grades 7 through 12. We did accomplish that. Archie arrived in 1953 as a freshman. 1953 was before we had integrated. So he enrolled as a freshman at Scarborough School. And the interesting thing about Archie was that he loved math and science. And so he was really excited. This is what Archie told me, right? To move to Oak Ridge High School in 1955-56, which was his junior year, because he said, I want more. And he said, I'm quoting him, I took all the math and science courses I could schedule. I went on a field trip to Huntsville, Alabama with the science club. And this is the story he tells. On the way home, we stopped near Chattanooga for a late evening meal where I was refused service.
Oh.
Every student immediately stood up and walked out. I was deeply moved by their support. He has other stories to tell. They weren't all perfect. But one of his greatest claims to fame, and he's still so proud of it whenever I talk to him, he was the first Black student inducted into the Oak Ridge High School National Honor Society. And though we haven't investigated this, he may have been the first Black student so honored in the Southeast. He won a scholarship. It was awarded by B'nai B'rith, the Jewish community, which allowed him to go to college. It was just enough money to get him to Indiana Technical College in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And he also supplemented his work while there as a brick mason. He said, I didn't know brick masonry, but I went out and volunteered to work on the job, and they taught me. And also was a parking lot attendant while he completed a freshman year at his Indiana school. But then he couldn't make enough money during the summer to go the second or the third year. So his education was delayed significantly. One other story, I'm going to step back to high school to tell about Archie. I asked him about those first 2 years. What sort of adversity or extreme situations would you want to talk about? And he wasn't really negative, but he said, well, I do remember that prom, our first year, which would have been his junior year, was split after a vote with the parents. And we were told that we could go to our separate Black prom from the rest of the students' prom, and that what they would do to be, quote, fair about it was to, whatever band was hired would play half of the time at the Black prom, the other half at the other prom. And he said, we met together and said, no, we won't do that. But the senior year, he said, we were all together and we had a great time for prom. Seems like I think there was another story. It won't come to me right now. Maybe as I work through this, it'll jump in my head. But I found that one very, very touching. He went on. Yeah.
Go ahead and finish.
Okay. He went on to work in California, and he worked with a very famous name, Theodore Maiman, who is known in this country, look him up, as the father of the laser. He could not find challenging work in Oak Ridge. He didn't have a degree. He was against all odds, but he did find an opportunity with the Science Center that traveled around to work with science programs in this area. He went as the sort of lab assistant, setting things up for the demonstrators, etc. Loved the job, but then he got a chance at a better one. And yet here's what happened. And I will quote again as I told the story. He could not find challenging work in Oak Ridge, where he was still paid less to do the comparable work of his white coworkers. And so when he asked about it, when he challenged it, he was told the white housing in the cities cost more than his housing. Therefore, they were paid more. So Archie said, I saw the writing on the wall. He said, I loved Oak Ridge. I loved the people. I had lots of roots here in his brief time. But he said, he answered it with, well, I wish I could live in the white housing areas, but I need to leave. I need to move on. So he had worked at Ortec, worked on Geiger counters, and he left for California. And we lost an incredible man to California, but he went on to amazing opportunities here. Here's my quick summary of what he accomplished. He did research and development in semiconductors, lasers, fiber optics, geodesic lens, and even established his own lens lab. Some of the companies he worked for, you might recognize Hughes, McDonnell Douglas, right? Then they split and he went with one of the two splits, etc. And that's Mr. Archie Lee. He's been back. He came back as the keynote speaker of the Scarborough 85 celebration. And oh my, he is just absolutely the warmest, most genuine, incredible man.
Benita, is he the one that went over to the University of Tennessee and was not accepted?
Yes. His counselor, his Oak Ridge High School counselor, actually helped him process the papers, was very excited because he had an amazing transcript. And it sat for a long time. He didn't hear right away, but finally heard toward the very, very end of his senior year that from UT, that his transcript was amazing, but they were sorry. He was denied on the basis of race. And actually, that was you were talking about 1957, right? The first Black undergraduates, and Black graduate students did exist at UT during that time. The first Black undergraduate student was admitted, I believe I remember, in January of 1961. And that was Theodis Robinson.
Oh, my goodness. But they turned Archie away.
Yep. It's their loss.
Yes, I agree. Okay, you ready for the next one?
I'm ready. Let's talk about B.B. Bell, as he was known. He arrived here because his dad was a West Point graduate assigned to Oak Ridge and to the Manhattan Project. And B.B. Bell actually started at Pine Valley School, which is the school administration building now, went on to Jefferson and then Oak Ridge High School. So he graduated in 1965. He was so enthusiastic, just an amazing man to talk to. And so I'm going to read something he said that I quoted in his story. This is from BB. Many lessons I applied to my military life came from what I learned on the practice fields and on Blankenship Field. I have fond memories of the Wildcat Den and Oak Ridge High School student's second father, Shep Lauder, the Oak Ridge Community Director of Youth Recreation. And I will tell you, over all of the interviews, the talks I've done across 75, not all 75, but the early classes, Shep Lauder's name comes up continuously. He was considered by many kids their second father. So he went on to the University of Chattanooga, now UT Chattanooga, right? But the University of Chattanooga back then. And I made contact with him because he was assigned a roommate that's well known in Oak Ridge, Keith Philauer. And Keith and BB have been lifelong friends. But he went on and he went on to the University of Chattanooga and on a ROTC scholarship, and ROTC scholarship. And he roomed with Keys, and he was frat brothers with Keys, and he were in each other's weddings, whatever. So like I said, lifelong friendship. Keys is not originally from Oak Ridge. He was from Cleveland, Tennessee, I should point out. So Obviously, having an ROTC scholarship, he had a required service to meet outside of his education. And so he started in an interesting, I'm sorry, I want to edit what I just said and say his journey is very interesting. His journey is one of major assignments that I actually pulled up some more of what B.B. Bell told me, because one of the questions I asked him was, what was your most rewarding or challenging or interesting assignments? Those were the words I used. Okay. So he said, my most challenging assignment was as the executive assistant to General A. Norman Schwarzkopf for nearly 3 years, when he served as the commander of the U.S. Central Command, which oversaw U.S. military operations in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. As a colonel, I worked directly for him, kept his schedule, worked his correspondence, reviewed and assessed all official documents headed for his desk, kept his personal log of his actions and activities, and was his key liaison with senior military and political leaders in Washington, as well as across the Central Command, which was the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine. I performed this job both in peace in the States and in war when we deployed for Desert Shield and Desert Storm. This is 1990 to 1991, where Schwarzkopf led the first Gulf War against Iraq and its invasion of Kuwait. Then he said, for my most interesting assignment was as the 4-star Allied commander, he's a 4-star general, of all military, South Korean and U.S. in South Korea, in the defense of South Korea. This included leading and commanding over 1 million men and women in uniform with a mission of deterring an attack from North Korea, and should deterrence fail, counterattacking into North Korea by land, sea, and air to defeat their armed forces and remove the government. And then finally, my most rewarding assignment was as the commander of the 2nd Quadrant 9th Cavalry Regiment. This unit, which was the reconnaissance unit for the 24th Mechanized Infantry Division, had a history and lineage dating back to the Buffalo Soldiers. I'm learning a lot of history because I had to look that up. Buffalo Soldiers were the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments organized just after the Civil War with all Black soldiers. Their service in the American West and in the Spanish-American War was stunning, and thus to be part of one of these units was an incredible honor and privilege. I had this position as a lieutenant colonel from 1985 to 1987. I just was gobsmacked by all he had done, all the honors he's accumulated.
Amazing.
And yet his pride in Oak Ridge is so great. It was wonderful to hear from this man who's gone so far. He retired in 2009 as a 4-star general.
Wow. What a story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You ready to move on?
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, let's head to the class of 66. We're talking my period of time, my high school period of time, right? But boy, is my high school story different from this guy. We're going to talk about Dick Seitz from the, I'm sorry, I said 66 and it's not. He's class of 65, my mistake. He started at Cedar Hill. He went on to Jefferson and Oak Ridge High School. He was in all his grades in Oak Ridge schools. As of the 5th grade, when Dick was age 10, which means he was already young. I did the math last night. I believe this would have been 1957. He wrote his first computer program, which ran successfully on the Oracle. And that acronym stands for the Oak Ridge Atomic Computer and Logical Engine. It's rather famous in computer science, right? That machine was at ORNL, And he wrote that program under the mentorship of Bob Covey, an interesting story in and of itself, Bob Covey. He used assembly language on this last of what he called the homemade computers. And those homemade computers, he said, became obsolete by 1960. Just real progressive woman, Mary Laycock, who actually hired me later. She was the math coordinator in the Oak Ridge schools, decided that these group of extremely bright kids needed more. So she chose Dick and 5 other students to begin the first 7th grade Algebra 1 course in Oak Ridge schools. And it grew over time. In fact, we have large numbers in 7th grade algebra now, even 6th grade, some of them. And that was strongly encouraged and supported by a long-term educator well known in this community, Lannis Pullum, who was a 5th and 6th grade teacher to those students. Dick, during his summers, a restless kid wanting more, attended two different years, 2 National Science Foundation summer camps targeting computer education. He also wrote programs. Wrote programs for his father's use at ORNL and was employed by the UT Computational Center the summer after Oak Ridge High School graduation. So the interesting part of that was, that was rather routine work in many ways, but he said it was absolutely life-changing because it allowed him access to the latest IBM machines that UT was using. And so he worked with the director and also with his own enterprising self to access every manual IBM had published on any of their machinery and read them all. I mean, we're talking about major amounts of reading and researching. He had Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, at age 16. But before he arrived there, he decided to write IBM to see if they would give him a job. And so on the way there, his parents and he stopped in, was it Poughkeepsie, the headquarters, I believe, in New York, right? They went out of their way to go to interview for the job. And they told him, well, they just didn't think they could hire a 16-year-old. He started asking them questions about their machinery and have they thought about this? Have they done that? Whatever. They didn't hire him. He went on to enroll in his freshman classes and got a phone call from IBM in Boston, there where MIT is, saying, would you like to work part-time? We can pay you $2.50 an hour, and you can work 10 hours weekly. Well, that was the beginning of a long college relationship. He worked more than his 10 hours. Of course he did, right? But he continued that through college. He actually taught in training centers in IBM during that time, whatever. Just an amazing story. And okay, so I'm going to quote this because I don't want to mess it up. In 1992, so he's into his career now, Dick was the co-architect of the fastest computer chip in the world. So he moved between hardware, software, whatever, but that was his job, his claim to fame in 1992. And the comment about that, as he described it to me, he says, over 100 million people daily use this system that he developed for detecting writing systems and the language, and it detects writing systems and language, and refers it to a Google translator. So his career has been in computer research, corporate development, software design. He is still a professor, although I believe emeritus, doesn't teach much, at Stanford. And he just published, I think last year, a graduate level textbook on measuring software performance.
Wow.
Interesting guy. We still stay in touch. He actually is considered one of the historical experts now, and oral histories of computer science include him quite often in the making. How we doing, Ray?
Okay, we're doing good. We're going to go for one more and then we'll wrap the session up and follow it with more later. Okay, so let's do one more.
All right, so let's go to 66, class of 66 now. Some of these stories I get because people refer them. And Ray, I believe you referred this one to me because you knew Dr. Paul Spray, right? Very, very beloved long-term physician in this town. Yeah, so we're going to meet Tom Spray. The picture Ray has up is of his high school, picture. Most of those have been. And the reason we didn't do that for Pearl and Charlie at first was the pictures that are out there for those early years are very grainy, very poor. So Tom Spray went to Elm Grove, then to Jefferson, and then to Oak Ridge High School. And the interesting thing about him is that if you'd met me as a young man, you wouldn't recognize what I became, because what he loved was art and theater. He was president of the Oak Ridge High School Thespians. He was active in the Oak Ridge Playhouse in his younger childhood. But he said during a summer in high school, he decided to go with his father, Dr. Paul Spray, on a mission, on a medical mission. Paul Spray was known for his work. He was a Quaker, very, very devout and servant of both his faith and his profession. His father was going to Algeria in the aftermath of the bloody French-Algerian War, and it is a horrible, horrible war. I read up on it. What had happened was the French doctors who were there had abandoned the country. And so there were just horrible numbers of wounded and ailing and suffering people. Tom said, I went because I wanted to improve my French speaking skills. I was French Algeria at the time, and observe surgeries for victims of the war. Changed me. So he went on to Haverford College and majored in molecular biology, then to Duke Medical School, then to a draft-required military assignment before he began his civilian career at St. Louis Children's Hospital. And it was there that he initiated a pediatric cardiothoracic surgical program. And it was that he performed the first pediatric lung transplant in the world. And one of the things he said to me about that, I had to do that on adult-sized operating tables. There were no children's operating rooms at the time. So by 1986, Tom Spray was performing heart transplants. I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. On children. Wow. In children-sized operating rooms, which he had mandated be built. He became chief of surgery, executive director of the Cardiac Center for Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and a worldwide consultant. He has trained more pediatric surgeons than perhaps anyone else in the world. And since this is our last one, I will end it with a personal note and say that little did I know at the time I was doing this interview that I would have a grandchild facing severe, severe heart surgeries, 3 open heart surgeries within his first 2 years. The first one, 24 hours after he was born. So I got to know the doctor quite well over time, as did my daughter. And I said to him, second or third time, because he had said something that sounded so much like Tom Spray. I said, do you know the name Tom Spray? And the doctor's mouth dropped open and he looked at me and he said, the doctor, the children's heart doctor? And I said, yes. And he said, everything we do comes straight from Tom Spray. So we've been blessed in this community with brilliant minds. I've been personally blessed.
Wow, that's amazing. You know, I've got a story about Dr. Spray, about Paul Spray. I was doing, and this is beside the point, but it's kind of a funny story. I was doing an interview, I think an oral history a few years ago with a woman, and she was a doctor. I don't remember her name, but she was a doctor here in town, and she said she was doing rounds at the hospital, and she went in to see this patient, this woman in this room, and she said, "This must be a really religious hospital." And the doctor said, she said, "I didn't know what you meant." She said, "What do you mean?" She says, "Well, every afternoon I hear over the intercom, Dr. Spray, Dr. Spray." So they were calling Dr. Spray. Anyway.
Thought they were praying.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, that's an amazing story. Did he continue his theatrical pursuits after he became an adult?
That's interesting. I asked him that. He said there was no time, but he said, "I'm transitioning to retirement," which he did. I believe he lives over near Hendersonville, North Carolina. And he said, "I targeted that area because I want to get back into the arts." And he said, "I've just been given a retirement gift of classes at one of the famous art centers, I'm sure in Asheville, in glass blowing." He said, "That's my newest avocation."
Wow. Well, that's amazing.
So I don't know about theater. I don't know.
Well, we're going to look forward to your next segment that we do and continue this, because all of these are fascinating.
Amazing. Very much so.
Well, we got through the 60s. We're ready to the 70s next round.
All right. We'll
Motor with
pick that
talent.
up. Yeah.
Sounds good. Is that going to be the next one, Ray?
Yes, it will be.
Okay. So in a couple of weeks, we'll have part 2 up for this.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And folks, we appreciate you joining us today. And we'll be back in about 2 weeks with part 2. Thank you.
Bye-bye.